I'm getting charged with what now?
We found enough, you call it probable cause,
Okay.
for a warrant to be issued.
Okay, a warrant for what, though?
It was for the murder.
What murder?
Gannon Stauch.
So, Gannon is murdered.
That's what the evidence shows.
Okay.
There's a lot of stories out there. So if someone truly took Gannon, though, we need to know the real story, because you put out quite a few different stories.
Back in January 2020, Albert Stauch was away on deployment with the National Guard. While he was gone, something terrible happened. His 11-year-old son, Gannon, just disappeared from their home in Colorado. By the time Albert got back, his wife, Letitia Stauch, had already told the police that Gannon was missing. The whole community started searching for him right away, and so did the police and volunteers. They looked everywhere, especially in those thick woods around El Paso County, but there was no sign of Gannon. The days turned into weeks, and no one knew what had happened to him. Gannon was just a regular kid who loved video games. He was curious about the world and had a big heart. He adored his mom and had a lot of love for his stepmother, Letitia, too. In fact, Gannon was a bit of a mama's boy, always showing his affection. But the saddest part? He never saw it coming. The person he trusted, the one he loved so much, ended up being the one who took his life. It's hard to believe, but that's how this most disturbing murder happened. Gannon Stauch was just 11 years old when he vanished from his home in Colorado Springs. It was a day that started off like any other, but by evening, everything changed. The last person to see Gannon alive was his stepmother, Letitia Stauch, who was 38 at the time. That night, just before 7 p.m., Letitia made a call to 911.
El Paso County 911. My son was supposed to be home at 6 o'clock, and it's almost 7. He's only 11. Okay. What's his name? Gannon.
She was frantic, reporting that Gannon was missing. But when the dispatcher told her to call a non-emergency number instead, things got a bit strange. You see, when she made that second call, Letitia couldn't remember any of Gannon's friends or even where they lived. It was odd, right? A mom not knowing the friends her stepson might be with. Anyway, by 10 p.m. that same night, deputies from the El Paso County Sheriff's Office arrived at the house. They were ready to do their job, and Letitia let them search the place. She first told them that Gannon hadn't come back after playing with a friend. But when the deputies asked her for the names of these friends, she didn't have an answer. It was like she was reaching, trying to come up with something.
I took the covers that he was laying down, and I just threw it on there because I got my daughter out and the dog's out. She was working, and it was something.
You got everybody now.
I know. It was something that we were just like.
Did he take his bike?
No.
Okay, because somebody saw a little kid on a bike. They posted it, but I didn't know if he brought it.
Well, he did, unless he took it sooner and brought it back, because Lena ends up getting a bike.
Okay.
And rides the bike because hers had broke. When she ran into him, I say ran into him as in not physically,
right.
but she somehow got his bike because hers wouldn't work. So he could have at one point.
So they were here.
Okay.
Yeah.
They were supposed to go pick him up for dinner. Okay.
Blue
and he never
and black.
How long have you guys lived here?
5 is running.
Maybe like a year and something now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you have talked to all of his friends' parents in the area?
I'm not the person that talks to the friends. I don't have numbers. I don't say yes. I don't say no. My husband tells them yes or no. So he has all the numbers.
So there could be some friends that you don't know.
Right. Because I don't know the people like that. And
then things took an even stranger turn. Letitia started telling a different story. She said that same guy with whom she had supposedly hired to fix a carpet had raped her. Not just that, she claimed this guy abducted Gannon after he had a bike accident. The whole thing sounded so wild, so out there, that it just made everyone more suspicious. I mean, how does a story change so drastically like that? As soon as Gannon was reported missing, the community jumped into action. Over 200 volunteers joined in, combing through the areas near his home, looking for any sign of the boy. They were searching everywhere, hoping for the best, but fearing the worst. It wasn't just the volunteers, though. The authorities were doing everything they could, too. They were out there in those vast woods near El Paso County, going through every nook and cranny. But despite all their efforts, Gannon's fate was still a mystery. Now, Gannon's dad, Al Stauch, was serving with the National Guard when all this was going down. He was away on deployment, and by the time he got back, the situation had already spiraled. His wife, Letitia, had reported Gannon missing, and the whole area was in the middle of a desperate search. But as the days went on, Al started to feel uneasy about everything. Something didn't add up. His wife's stories didn't make sense, and her behavior was just off. So Al decided to take a step further. He let the FBI listen in on his phone calls with Letitia. He was hoping that maybe, just maybe, he could get her to slip up and reveal everything about what really happened to Gannon. The FBI spent hours going through those recorded conversations, listening closely, hoping to find a clue, anything that would lead them to the truth. What did they find? Well, that's when things get complicated.
I didn't have a phone to call 911. They're supposed to be taking him back and I called 911.
So the guy took him to take him to 911? The Craigslist guy? Quincy Brown or whatever.
Yeah, I swear to God, Quincy's real.
What I'm trying to work out with you here is just the freaking truth.
Albert, I'm telling you, he hurt Gannon. I was fine.
Okay, well, who is he? Who tied you up? Who did this? You didn't do it. Who did it? Who hurt Gannon? Who has Gannon?
Albert, they're gonna kill me.
Who is they? These are the questions I need to know.
They first told me his name was Eduardo, but it's not. It's Quincy Brown.
So Quincy Brown is the one who has him.
He's coming after me because I know who he is.
Quincy Brown is the one holding Gannon for all the money? And you didn't tell me. So 3 weeks now, you've known who has my son.
They didn't find a direct answer, but there was something important in those calls. It was enough to keep everyone on high alert, enough to make people think that Letitia knew more than she was letting on. The story wasn't adding up, and everyone could feel it. On the day Gannon disappeared, there was something that happened that just didn't sit right with anyone who heard about it later. Letitia Stauch asked her teenage daughter to go to the store around 5 p.m. She told her to pick up carpet cleaning supplies, baking soda, trash bags, and a few other things. Now, at first, that might not seem like a big deal, but when you think about it, why would she need those things right then, especially on the very day Gannon went missing? This raised a lot of red flags, so the authorities started digging deeper. They wanted to know what else might have been going on that day, and that's when they discovered something that really pointed the finger at Letitia. It turns out that on the very morning of Gannon's disappearance, Letitia was looking up car rentals. She rented a car and drove to the neighboring Douglas County. This was a huge lead for the police. They began to think that if Letitia had hurt Gannon, then maybe she had used that trip to get rid of his body. So the search effort shifted to Douglas County. The authorities were on high alert, combing through every area they could think of where Letitia might have gone. They hoped they would find Gannon, or at least some clues as to what had happened to him. And, in a way, they did. During the search, they found traces of Gannon's blood.
He was bleeding.
Where was he bleeding from?
His arms, his knees, his hand.
It was heartbreaking, but it also confirmed their worst fears, that something terrible had happened to the boy. But even with this evidence, Gannon's body was nowhere to be found. The search continued, but it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The police found out that Letitia didn't just make that one trip to Douglas County. About a month after Gannon's disappearance, she took another trip, this time in a van, and she wasn't alone. She brought her 17-year-old daughter with her, and together they traveled all the way from Colorado to Pensacola, Florida. Now, you have to wonder, why would she make such a long trip, especially during such a chaotic time when everyone was desperately looking for Gannon? When they got to Florida, Letitia and her daughter stayed at a hotel. This hotel wasn't just any hotel, though. It was located just 3 miles away from a spot where everyone's worst fears were realized on March 17th. You see, that's when authorities finally found what they had been searching for, Gannon's remains. It was a discovery that broke everyone's hearts, but it also gave them the answers they had been searching for all along. The trip to Florida, the strange shopping list, the rental car, everything started to make a twisted kind of sense. On March 17, 2020, Gannon's remains were finally found, but they weren't anywhere near his home in Colorado. Instead, a maintenance worker made the discovery under the Escambia Bay Bridge in Pace, Florida, over 1,300 miles away. This worker wasn't even looking for Gannon. He was just doing his job. He and some bridge inspectors from the Florida Department of Transportation were working on the bridge when they noticed something odd, a suitcase tucked away beneath it. Now, finding a suitcase under a bridge might not seem like much at first, but when they opened it, what they found was something that would send chills down anyone's spine. Inside the suitcase was the body of a young boy wrapped up in blankets. It didn't take long for the authorities to confirm that this was Gannon. The search that had lasted for weeks, with people hoping and praying that he'd be found safe, ended in the most heartbreaking way possible. When the medical examiners got to work, the details that came out were nothing short of horrifying. The cause of Gannon's death was determined to be a mix of brutal injuries, blunt force trauma, sharp force injuries, and even a gunshot wound. Gannon had been shot in the jaw, stabbed multiple times in the chest and back, and he also had a severe skull fracture. The pain and suffering he must have endured were unimaginable. They found that Gannon had defensive wounds on his arms and legs, signs that he had tried to protect himself. There was even a bullet still lodged in his skull. This was no accident. This was a vicious, deliberate act.
Tell the jury about that. Why did it stand out to you?
Because it looked like she was struggling with it.
Did you offer to help her?
Yep.
What'd she say?
She didn't need help.
Did you ask her what's in the suitcase?
Yep.
What'd she say?
She told me it was softball stuff.
Now, Letitia's half-brother, Dakota Lowry, had something to say about all this in court. He wasn't just some distant relative. He knew Letitia well. When he took the stand, he said something that made everyone stop and listen. He said that deep down, he knew his sister was the one who took Gannon's life. But at first, Dakota didn't believe it. He thought the accusations against Letitia were wrong, that there was no way she could have done something so terrible. He even wanted to help with the search, holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, Gannon was still out there somewhere, alive and waiting to be found.
And what you're meaning is the Letitia that you know, the only way she could have done something so horrible is she had some type of mental break.
When everything first happened, and we found out that the little boy was found in the body, we found out where he was found. At that point, I knew she did it because when I seen that suitcase and asked her about it, she just acted funny to me. And yeah, I thought she might have snapped me.
Dakota also shared how he felt frustrated with the way law enforcement treated them that day. He said he felt like they were being looked at as if they were criminals, which only added to his confusion and anger. But then something happened that made everything start to click into place for Dakota. He remembered seeing Letitia struggling with one of her suitcases. Now, this wasn't just any suitcase. It was heavy, like she was having a hard time moving it. Being the good brother he was, Dakota offered to help her out, but Letitia refused his help, saying she didn't need it. That struck him as odd, and when he asked what was inside the suitcase, she brushed it off, telling him it was just softball stuff. It wasn't until later, when the prosecution showed a picture from the crime scene in Florida, that Dakota's world turned upside down. They asked him if he recognized anything in the picture, and that's when it all came flooding back. The suitcase in the photo, the one that held Gannon's remains, was the same one he saw Letitia struggling with. That's when it hit him like a ton of bricks. He knew she had killed Gannon. It was a moment that Dakota would never forget, a moment when everything he had tried to deny became all too real. And that takes us back to the terrible day of January 27th, the day Letitia allegedly took Gannon's life. They were in their home in the Larson Ranch neighborhood, just southeast of Colorado Springs. Letitia stabbed Gannon 18 times and shot him 3 times. One of those bullets went through his jaw. It was a brutal, senseless act of violence against a child who trusted her, who probably never saw it coming. The morning after Gannon disappeared, Letitia Stauch did something that made people start to question her even more. She drove her car to the Colorado Springs airport and just left it there. But she didn't stick around. Instead, she rented another car, picked up Gannon's father, Albert Stauch, from his flight and drove him back home in that rental. Now, you can imagine Albert's confusion when he got off that plane and saw Letitia in a different car. He'd only been out of town for 2 days, but when Letitia picked him up in a rental instead of her own car, it set off alarm bells in his mind. It just didn't feel right. Letitia tried to explain it away, saying she didn't want to put more miles on her leased car while searching for Gannon. She told Albert that she had left her own car parked at the school where she worked. But something about that explanation didn't sit well with Albert. As the day went on, things just got stranger. Later that night, Letitia went back to retrieve her car. She didn't just take it home, though. Instead, she drove to an area near Colorado 105 and South Perry Park Road in Douglas County. Investigators later came to believe this was the spot where she initially dumped Gannon's body. What made this even more suspicious was the fact that Letitia's phone appeared to be in airplane mode for several hours that night. It was like she was trying to make sure no one could track where she was going or what she was doing. And as we have talked before, searchers later found a board in that area with Gannon's blood on it.
When we found the board up in southern Douglas County, she had to explain why Gannon's DNA would be found on that board. And what we learned throughout those phone calls is, one, the level of lying that she was willing to undergo to deflect the investigation away from being pointed at her, but also she was giving us little clues throughout where she would actually include small snippets of truth, but she would do it in a way that would explain away why that truth existed and why somebody else was responsible for that truth.
That board was a crucial piece of evidence that tied everything together. During this time, Letitia's story kept changing, making it harder and harder to believe her. At first, she said Gannon didn't come home because he went to visit a friend. But when the authorities pressed her for details, she switched it up. Suddenly, she was claiming that a Mexican man had raped her and abducted Gannon.
Okay. He had one of the guns. And I was terrified. Okay. So terrified. And then he just knocked me down and like towards Gannon's room. And he was hitting on me. It was hard, on the ground. And he was trying to rape me. And I told her. And I said, I have to tell you about this. Okay. And
the story was so outlandish that it only raised more questions. Why would she keep changing her story unless she was trying to cover something up? As the investigation went on, prosecutors started putting the pieces together. They learned that Gannon likely died on the same day that Letitia first contacted investigators. They found blood evidence that linked back to that terrible day. They found Gannon's blood on Letitia's shoes, which was a major red flag. They also found Letitia's DNA on a gun that was linked to Gannon's death. It was becoming clear that Letitia's ever-changing stories were just a way to distract from the horrible truth. Letitia's behavior, from parking her car at the airport to renting a new one, seemed like an attempt to throw people off her trail. But as the evidence piled up, it became harder for her to keep her story straight. The fact that she drove out to that isolated area in Douglas County, where Gannon's blood was later found, painted a grim picture of what really happened. And the discovery of the board with Gannon's blood on it, that was the kind of evidence that couldn't be explained away by another one of Letitia's stories. Now, as we mentioned before, Letitia Stauch had rented a van, and in that van, Letitia and her daughter were still moving. They headed to Orlando and then on to South Carolina. You see, Letitia was on the run. The authorities were closing in on her, and it wasn't long before they caught up. They arrested her in South Carolina, bringing an end to her attempts to escape justice. She was taken into custody. Even after her arrest, Letitia wasn't done trying to wiggle out of the consequences of her actions. She came up with a plan to escape from jail. It sounds almost unbelievable, but she reportedly asked another inmate for help. Her plan? To use a broom handle to break the window in her cell. She'd even measured herself to make sure she could fit through the gap once the window was broken. It was like she couldn't accept that there was no way out, that she would have to face what she had done. All these actions, running away, hiding Gannon's body, and then trying to escape from jail, paint a picture of someone who is desperate, not just to avoid getting caught, but to avoid the truth. Letitia's arrest in South Carolina was the beginning of the end for her, but it was also the beginning of justice for Gannon. As the truth started coming out, piece by piece, it became clear that she had done everything in her power to hide what she had done. But the evidence was too strong, too damning.
You can go down that road, but it's not going to save you in court.
What?
Because you're the last adult with him.
So,
and nobody else, just let me try to protect you. I'm not trying to hurt you here. This is actually protecting you. If you don't tell us where to go investigate, then nobody's going to investigate for you. You're the last adult with him. You told a lot of lies about all these injuries from his foot.
I didn't tell lies to you or to any police officers.
Did a sex assault happen in the house?
I didn't tell any lies to you or a police officer.
On January 19, 2021, a mental health evaluation was submitted to the court, and it stated that Letitia was competent to stand trial. This was a big step because it meant that the court believed she understood what was going on and could participate in her own defense. Not long after, the judge granted Letitia's request to represent herself in court. Her defense team argued that Letitia had suffered a major psychotic break during the brutal killing of Gannon. They painted a picture of a woman who was deeply disturbed and had lost touch with reality at the time of the crime. But the state wasn't buying it. The prosecutors pointed out that Letitia's elaborate attempts to cover up the murder and derail the investigation proved she knew exactly what she was doing. They argued that her actions showed a clear understanding of right and wrong, which meant she couldn't hide behind an insanity plea.
Despite that, are you able to come with an expert opinion regarding her sanity at the time of the death of Gannon?
Yes.
What is your opinion?
Well, I think that she was that assuming that this area is about the time that Gannon was killed.
Yes.
She was psychotic at the time. She was not in touch with reality, and she did not. I don't think she knew the difference between right and wrong. I don't know whether she even knew what she was doing.
Then, on September 23, 2021, after listening to a testimony from law enforcement officers and expert witnesses, the judge ruled that the case would go to trial. The evidence was strong and the stakes were high. By February 11, 2022, Letitia changed her plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. She was sticking to the story that she was not in her right mind when she killed Gannon, hoping it would spare her from the harshest punishment. But the trial brought out the truth that couldn't be ignored. Letitia was convicted of all the charges against her over 3 years after the horrific crime took place. The prosecutors laid it all out for the jury. Letitia had stabbed Gannon 18 times, hit him in the head, and then shot him once. They argued that she did this because she hated Gannon and wanted to hurt his father, Al Stauch, who was away on a National Guard deployment at the time. It was clear to them that Letitia had a motive driven by anger and a desire to cause pain.
Their job is to put doubt in the jurors' minds, right? And those videos were certainly compelling.
Even though Letitia didn't deny killing Gannon, she still pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Her defense team argued that she was in the middle of a psychotic break caused by the trauma she had endured throughout her life, particularly from her troubled childhood. They tried to convince the jury that her actions were the result of deep-seated psychological issues and not a calculated murder. But the experts from the state mental hospital had a different story to tell. They concluded that Letitia had a personality disorder with borderline and narcissistic features, but she was sane when Gannon was killed.
I believe that you must know the nature of what you have done and that it was wrong, and that also I think that you do add on a bit of the Durham decision, which has to do with if you cannot control.
According to Colorado law, being sane means understanding the difference between right and wrong and being able to form the intent to commit a crime. The jury listened carefully, and in the end, they rejected the insanity defense. Letitia was found guilty of first-degree murder after deliberation. First-degree murder of a child by a person in a position of trust, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence.
We, the jury, find the defendant Letitia Stauch guilty.
The verdict was clear. She was responsible for Gannon's death, and her attempts to cover it up just showed how much she understood the gravity of what she had done. On the same day the verdict was read, Judge Gregory Werner sentenced Letitia to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 156 years. He calls her actions the most horrific I have ever seen. He made it clear that she deserved the maximum sentence that I can impose, according to Colorado law.
You have shown no remorse throughout this process. Instead, you've made a choice to build a web of lies because you didn't want to face the consequences. Your conduct in this case deserves the maximum punishment. I remand you to the custody of the Colorado Department of Corrections for the remainder of your life with no possibility of parole.
What struck everyone in the courtroom was Letitia's reaction, or rather, the lack of one. As the verdict was read, she didn't show any emotion. She just sat there at the defense table, sandwiched between her two lawyers, seemingly unmoved by the words that sealed her fate. Even after the court session ended, while people were talking and moving around, Letitia sat there alone, quietly sipping water. On the other hand, Gannon was a young boy with his whole life ahead of him, and it was cut short in the most brutal way. Letitia's actions, both during the crime and in the courtroom, left a lasting impact on everyone who followed the case. The trial brought justice, but it also reminded us of the profound loss that can never be undone.